Performance and body art. Performance art involves live events, actions, or presentations, usually by the artist, him or herself, or occasionally involving other volunteers or other actors. Now, within this broad definition, we might see a lot of variety within performance art. So it may be pre-scripted or impromptu. It may take place in front of an audience or in isolation, usually in that case documented with photography, video, or even in writing. It may involve audience participation, and it may involve elaborate stage and objects, or it could be just the lone performer. So that's a lot of variety. One important other qualifier that would differ performance art from theater, which is a close cousin, you might say. One thing would be that performance art comes from the tradition of visual art, and so it comes out of that conversation dominantly. Other specific characteristics would be that performance art is usually non-narrative, so it's not trying to tell you an entire story. Secondly, it's real rather than enacted situations or events, or you could say it's action rather than acting. So whatever the performance artist is putting him or herself through, whatever actions or strategies they're using, it is a real environment, a real situation. They're not going to pretend some emotion, pretend to be happy or sad or having a particular reaction. It's all going to be their true reactions to the given situation. Now, performance art really takes off in the 60s and 70s, but we have the foundations being laid as early as the 1950s. And it's interesting to see that it's not just any one artist or one group, but international artists and groups around the world begin experimenting with kind of breaking from the traditional forms of painting and sculpture and looking for new avenues. And one thing that a lot of them seem to be interested in is a multi-sensory experience for the audience. So instead of just hanging something or putting a sculpture on a pedestal in a museum and the artist walking away and sort of, sometimes we talk about making orphans, that artists make orphans. We put this artwork in the museum and we walk away and we never see it again. But artists wanted, instead of that, they actually wanted a more face-to-face interaction with their viewer. They wanted to give the audience member a chance to speak or to interact with the artwork or with the artist directly instead of this kind of removed situation of the traditional museum. So one of our earliest examples would come from composer John Cage, who starts in music as an instrumental composer, classical composer, and then begins to explore with more experimentation. And he has some very interesting ideas. He talks about sound as experience without meaning. So sound being pure aesthetic experience. And he talks about the inability of music to communicate feeling. Now this might sound very strange because many of us listen to music and we associate a certain chord or a certain rhythm with happiness or with sadness or moodiness or with love even. But for Cage, he really said, we are just pinning all of our feelings onto music, but if we really listen to the music itself, it is just this beautiful, pure experience all on its own, and we don't need to sort of interpret it in our into our human emotions. And so he listens to the sound with this kind of pure idea. And he talks about ready-made sounds, just in the same way Duchamp talks about ready-made forms. So Cage, instead of being annoyed by, say, the sounds of the urban setting, the traffic and the car horns honking, etc., he actually hears those as musical components, musical sounds, like ready-made sounds. And he also really enjoys using chance as a tool, or even you might say accident as a tool. So let's see some of the things he does. One thing he does is that he goes and explores non-traditional materials. So he gets out, in this case you can see him sitting at a child's toy piano and using it as an instrument. He would also use instruments such as tea kettles and rubber ducks and ice in blenders, and create these chance events where he would turn on the radio at uncontrolled stations. So you might get music, you might get talk radio, you might get just static. But again, enjoying that as a ready-made aesthetic experience, a ready-made sound. This image here is a performance of John Cage's Water piece from 1959 at Vanderbilt University's Blair School of Music as part of their John Cage Centennial Celebration from 2012. So just a couple years ago, they performed this and several of his pieces. Now, this piece has definitely a comical side, and several of his pieces do, where it's, it's got a silliness to see that someone's making a musical composition with ice in a blender and shaking a margarita maker and pouring ice into a bathtub, or strumming the strings of the piano rather than playing the keys of the piano. This particular piece was actually completely choreographed, so he actually had written it out in a rather traditional way, had it timed, so you can see in this performer's hand, he's actually in his left hand has a stopwatch, so that he knows exactly at which second he needs to push each button or walk over to the next station and, jiggle the ice in the glass, etc. So there's definitely a sense of playfulness, but at the same time, Cage is very studious and very serious about the new ideas that he's putting out there. That sound is a pure aesthetic experience, that the audience needs to be active in the performance, so someone's coughing in the audience becomes a part of the artwork that he's created. Cage also created a really landmark piece called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And this piece is even sort of infamous, you might say, because what it is that Cage would walk out to the podium or to the piano, sit down, open the music, raise his hand as if to signal the symphony or the orchestra around him, and then sit absolutely silently for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So instead of writing a traditional musical piece, what he's actually done is turn the attention back on the sounds of the room, back onto the audience who are shifting in their seats or coughing or sneezing or clearing their throats, or the rattling of the page becomes a part of the sonic experience. So letting chance, audience participation, and a multi-sensory experience happen, letting it unfold naturally rather than controlling the sounds as in a typical composition. Well, simultaneously, or almost, Alan Capro is another artist working in the idea of performance or creating events in which people can participate. So one of his pieces, again, very playful piece, was called Yard, which he simply filled a building in an alleyway with inner tubes like these, tires, and then let people interact with them. So again, instead of sculpture and paintings that aren't supposed to be touched, in which you have to stay, 12 inches away from, here is artwork where you can go and jump and play and talk and interact. And again here, Words, 1961, where he filled a space with rolls of paper and sheets of paper all over the ceiling and floors, and invited the audience to come in and write whatever they wanted to, anywhere they wanted to. And so people began filling pages with just absurd words, things off the top of their heads, but also poems they'd memorized or poems they were writing or journal entries. All kinds of things became, all kinds of themes became possible in this place. And I think the audience felt, rather than feeling like they were coming to a museum or an art event to get told what to feel, they actually got to bring their own content to the experience. So again, giving a lot of power to the audience to participate and create the work along with the artist. A third group going on almost simultaneously from the late 50s and through the 60s would be a group called Fluxus. And Fluxus still actually has active members continuing. These are some of their characteristics. They were notably an international group with a wide range of ages, genders, and disciplines. So some of them came from visual art discipline, but some of them came from music or from theater or from other disciplines altogether. They were very interested in experimentation and chance and immateriality. So they weren't trying to make a product that could be bought or sold, but more focused on making an experience. Multi-sensory primary experiences. So they didn't want to reenact something or stage something. They wanted it to be a first-hand experience for their viewers, and multi-sensory. So Fluxus, they spoke a lot about not just a visual experience, but also a physical experience, even thought about the smells of the space in which they were acting, etc. So really thinking about all five senses. They were looking for active participation of the audience and multiple interpretations. So again, as in conceptual art, they didn't believe that the artist was the sole, almost divine creator who owned kind of the true interpretation, but that every person's interpretation was valid. No single controlled gaze, meaning you might see it from a variety of positions around a room or around the staging area. Merging of disciplines and a merging of art and life, as we'll see in our next example. And art as not a product, but a way of thinking and acting. It's not a product or a show of skill. Art is not an illustration of an idea, feeling, or narrative, but it is something created with that idea, feeling, or narrative. So a lot of really interesting ideas there. An example would be Alison Knowles' piece, Make a Salad. This is a much more recent performance and photograph of it. But in the 60s, she created this piece just literally about making a salad. So realizing that some of the things we do in our everyday lives are very artful, and that they actually have not just a final end result that we're after, but that the process of these things can be beautiful. So the process of chopping vegetables and what you even hear, the rhythm of the knife or the smell that comes from the onion as you begin to cut it, or the texture of each various vegetable and how those textures are different. And then, of course, the eating of the salad is also part of the art experience. So this is, of course, merging visual art with culinary arts. It has a sculptural element as well to it, so it's a merging of many disciplines in art and life. Another example of quite a different tone would be this piece by Yoko Ono called Cut Piece from 1964. And Yoko Ono, you probably recognize her name. She was married to John Lennon, but even before their relationship, she was already an established artist and has done much since their relationship as well. With Cut Piece, she actually went out onto a stage, fully clothed, and invited the audience to come up and cut pieces off of her clothing using scissors. Now, this piece requires her to be incredibly vulnerable. Think about how you feel just meeting a new person. Sometimes you feel very vulnerable just shaking hands with someone or just making eye contact with someone. But this piece was really about that same kind of vulnerability, the trust that we give to each other as we come into relationship with one another. And this piece, I think, is also a good example of how the piece can change, the artwork can change, depending on the context and the audience participation. So she's actually performed this piece many times in the 60s, in those first few years, but then also since 2000, she's repeated it. And each time is really different. If it's a very docile, friendly crowd, you might say, they'll come up and kind of just take tiny snippet and be very gentle with her, and it's actually like a very intimate and gentle relationship or gentle performance. However, she's also had times where there is a kind of angst in the air, or even because of her relationship with Lennon, there was a sort of has been a kind of angst directed toward her, in which the piece becomes, rather than this intimate and gentle interaction between the artist and audience, it almost becomes a bit aggressive, a bit violent. Removing someone's clothes can be both intimate or violent, depending on that context, right? So performance art also has that contingency. Joseph Beuys was loosely related to Fluxus, but he's also an independent German artist who is very pivotal in performance art and just art of the 20th century. He was raised in Germany during the Nazi era. He was forced into the German army, not working directly with concentration camps or anything, but as a pilot. And a lot of his work right after the wars really dealt with a lot of guilt that I think the larger German population had for not understanding more of what was going on, not stopping it before it happened, not knowing how to deal with it as it was happening, and just the sense of the land having this horrifying history even the land itself, along with the culture being wounded and scarred. And so a lot of his work is trying to find a peace, trying to find reconciliation. And he would often do performances that might be much more like a lecture. Like you can see him here speaking to a group of students, but he would sometimes also do these even in museums, where he would talk about the nature of art and its healing possibilities. He often said that everyone is an artist and that everything can be an artwork, and that art and life should have sort of backflow from one to another, rather than just art feeding life. Life will also feed art, and so on and so forth. One of his most famous performance pieces was called I Like America and America Likes Me, and it's from 1974. So here's a photograph of him here huddled under this felt blanket. And what he did was he came to the U.S., it was his first time visiting, and he was driven straight from the airport in a hearse to the gallery, where he spent about 2 weeks in the gallery living with a coyote. And then after the 2 weeks was taken back by vehicle back to the airport, and then he left immediately. So his entire trip to the U.S. was just this performance. He wanted to make sure that it wasn't any kind of like a tourist event at the same time. So he came to the gallery, and he lives harmoniously with this animal. And the coyote he chose as a symbol of the American West and kind of the American pioneering spirit. But he was thinking about parallels of man and nature coming into a harmonious relationship, and men from one nationality, or men and women from one nationality coming into harmony with men and women from another nationality. And even with the idea of that German past, although this piece does relate more to the U.S., he's still really interested in peaceable relationships in the spiritual realm as well. So how do we make peace with our own past, with our own sins, with our own ghosts, right? So trying to find a parallel in this performance piece. Now the roots of performance we can find in a number of places, some likely and some unlikely. We might see it even in abstract expressionism, where it was not so much the end product as the process that was put on display. When we look at Jackson Pollock's work, we're very much aware of his acting, his performance in creating this piece. And Alan Caprow, the performance artist, also makes this statement that points directly toward abstract expressionist Pollock, as I see him, left us at the point where we must become preoccupied with and even dazzled by the space and objects of our everyday life. Not satisfied with the suggestion through paint of our other senses, we shall utilize the specific substances of sight, sound, movements, peoples, odors, touch, etc. So after Pollock, Caprow at least felt that you couldn't go back to just representing things, but that we wanted direct engagement. We wanted not just a picture that suggested a smell or a picture that suggested a texture, but we really wanted the actual sight, sound, movements, odors, etc. And other artists coming off of abstract expressionism, someone like Yves Klein, who was kind of in a transition period after ABEX, but he would make abstract works and loosely figurative works like these ones, but have them performed in a sense. So he would actually paint the bodies of several of his assistants and then let them perform the paintings. And also, of course, we can make connections to Dada, pop, and even land art. Different movements and with different artists who elevated the concept of art or originality of concept over traditional materials, over traditional skill and technique. And those same movements also help to break boundaries across diverse disciplines and break the boundaries between art and life. Now, body art is a specific subset of performance art. And here, the human body itself becomes the art material, becomes the focus. Many of these artists are interested in things like the strengths and limits of the human body, the appetites of the human body. Some of them also deal with issues of identity, of gender, and sexuality. Dennis Oppenheim here gives us an early example. It's called Reading Position for a Second-Degree Burn. And he simply sat out in the sun for 3 or more hours, let himself be burnt, and then reveals the imprint of the book. It's a little bit of a playful idea of trying to, how we try to ingest knowledge, how do we try to interact with knowledge here symbolized by the book. How has the book made its impression on him? Now, it is during this time that we also will see some people going to what we might call more of an extreme, and to some of the kind of ethical gray areas when it comes to performance art. So we have, in this case with Chris Burden, he did a piece called Shoot in 1971, where he actually had a friend aim at him with a .22 rifle. He meant to be grazed by the bullet, but he was actually kind of flinched as the shot went out, and so he actually was shot through the arm. He also did a second piece called Transfixed in 1974, where he had himself nailed to a Volkswagen, so a sort of a crucifix on the back of this car. Now, we might ask, there's a lot of valid ethical questions to be asked about how far is too far, when does it become masochism rather than art. It's interesting to put this in its own time. So in the early 70s, we've got the civil rights era still going on with a lot of marches and still some violence. We've also got the Vietnam era where violence and death and soldiers coming up missing was very typical, and even protests of the Vietnam War, both in the States and internationally. So you even have some cases of monks burning themselves, let's say, images of that kind that were reported all over the world. So there is a strange, a high amount of violence in culture at large, or on the minds of people in culture at large at the moment. What Burden himself writes about Transfixed, he writes this: Transfixed, Venice, California, April 23rd, 1974. Inside a small garage on Speedway Avenue, I stood on the rear bumper of a Volkswagen. I lay on my back over the rear section of the car, stretching my arms onto the roof. Nails were driven through my palms onto the roof of the car. The garage door was open and the car was pushed halfway out onto the speedway. Screaming for me, the engine was running at full speed for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, the engine was turned off and the car pushed back into the garage. The door was closed. One thing that strikes me about this is that his description of this work and many of his works tends to be very matter-of-fact. And so I get the sense that he's not some overly romantic or melancholy or depressed person kind of making a scream for help, but that he's actually very thoughtful about these actions as symbolic gestures. He seems to be interested in pushing those physical limits and the art kind of ethical limits. But he's also trying to, I think, engage an audience for whom violence has become an everyday affair. And seeing this violence as an art action does actually get our attention. We, even I think today with the various wars and troubles going on around the world today, it's hard for news of violence to catch our attention. We hear daily reports of numbers of people killed by suicide bombings and other ordeals. But to hear of an artist undergoing this kind of thing does still catch our attention. And so it has the potential to make us think about violence, or make us think about the limits of the body, or make us think about how we should treat the body in a way that we might not be able to be engaged through, say, daily news reports. It is also interesting to think of the Volkswagen as a German-made vehicle that was actually, Hitler had ties to the initial Volkswagen company. And so it's a car of the people, Volkswagen. But here we also see kind of the misuse of the car and the misuse of Christianity in the same way, in a similar way perhaps to what Hitler used and misused the people of Germany and misused Christianity in his ascension to power and in the Holocaust. So a challenging work, definitely. It's certainly not all performance art crosses quite these boundaries. We do still have, in terms of these core issues, originality of form and concept remain highly prioritized. In terms of material, the primary significance is the artist or performer as a material. In terms of skill and technique, it's non-traditional, and the activities may vary widely. So in some cases, there's not a lot of skill required. In the case of Yoko Ono's cut piece, she just has to sit still and let others cut. In some cases, though, there can be very strenuous activities going on in a performance. And the expression, we will see cultural as well as personal expressions in the variety of performance pieces. A piece like Anna Mendieta here is both personal and cultural, I think, as she explored in the late 70s the ideas of femininity and feminism as it's linked to nature and even also to ideas of mortality. So here she would go out into nature and perform these actions, usually in private or with just a small group of friends or classmates, and someone to help her document them, so they weren't for a large audience. Or, as recently as 2002, this example of Belgian artist Francis Elise, who most often lives down in Mexico and spends time in South and Central America. This piece called When Faith Moves Mountains from 2002, he utilized 500 volunteers, and on a kind of a mountainous land outside of Lima, Peru, they actually each were armed with a shovel, and they scooped shovelfuls of dirt one after another, one step after another, as they walked from one side of the mountain to the other. So in a very literal sense, they actually moved this mountain, an almost imperceptible amount, just, a one shovelful per person moving on the mountain. But it brings together ideas of faith and works, you might say. It brings together ideas of what can be accomplished when we are working in conjunction with other people. And he's specifically reflecting on problems in the society and government of South and Central America, where there has been, for decades, much and longer, for much instability in terms of governments. So when faith can move mountains. Just one last pair. A piece by Marina Abramovic, a very well-known and respected performance artist, and her partner of many years, Ule. This piece is from 1980 called Rest Energy. And they're actually both leaning against each other, holding on to this armed bow. And so the arrow is actually pointing toward her heart, and each of them are pulling on an opposite part of it. And if either of them flinched in the wrong way, the arrow could have been loosed and would have, in fact, injured her. Ule reflects on it. He says, "Together we held a taut bow and a poised arrow. The weight of our bodies put tension on the bow while the arrow pointed at Marina's heart. Small microphones were attached to both our hearts, recording the increasing number of our heartbeats." So in this piece, there, for the viewers, it was the tension of these two bodies, the tension of what could happen if something went awry. It's the sound of these heartbeats reacting to the tension. And so there's something beautiful here about the vulnerability again and the trust in a relationship, the need for a balance of rest, but also a balance of energy. If either of them become sort of lazy and fall backward, they might hurt one another or hurt her. But if they're also too wound up, too frenetic, they also might run into trouble. And so there's this kind of balance between rest and energy between the two in their relationship. When Marina Abramovic and Ule decided to part ways, both as a couple and as partners in making work, they actually even did that in an artistic way. They actually traversed the Great Wall of China, beginning at opposite sides, walked toward each other, met and greeted, and then parted and passed on, completing the walk in isolation. So they had this great amount of time to walk toward each other, contemplating their relationship, their past and present, and then moved on toward their future. So just an interesting way that performance can use metaphors, parallels, actions to bring our attention to larger issues. Challenges and critiques of performance art. Of course, how do we sell a work that's not a single portable work? It does often rely on photographic or video documentation, which is often too bad because it's really exciting to see performance art in person. Exciting and strange and interesting and challenging. But to see the documentation is definitely a removal. It definitely is less intense of an experience. There are, of course, ethical questions regarding the use of the human body as an artistic material, and ethical questions and moral questions regarding private and public action or private and public nudity, etc. So what is possible? What is ethical? I think that some of these questions can also be asked about reality TV, reality documentation, the way that we know it to be today. As I was thinking about Christopher Burden's piece Shoot, where he was literally shot through the arm, that doesn't seem that far away from some of the reality kinds of programming that we have today. Even you might be aware of the MTV show called Jackass from several years ago, where they would do all kinds of crazy stunts in the name of entertainment. So just interesting questions for us to ask about art, but also culture and life at large. Some links for your online journal you might consider Smart History, The Art Story, or PBS's Art 21 does also have a segment about Marina Abramovic. It can be helpful to look up any of the different artists that we've looked at in this lecture or in earlier ones as you are working on your online journals. All right, thank you guys. Enjoy.